that word is being used. Sophie Cunningham rally planned for WNBA game tonight. Join us. Ben Daniel Podcast TV channel. On the Venue, live watch party. I'll be moderating the stream. Ben Daniel will be live. Hang out. Have a good time. Trust me, we talk about things other than the game.
Watch that reaction carefully, because what you're seeing right now is someone genuinely confused about why supporting women in women's sports has become controversial. And that confusion, it's about to spark one of the most divisive moments in WNBA history. We're talking about a pre-game rally in Seattle that has media members calling for boycotts, fans accusing each other of hate speech, and league insiders wondering if the WNBA just crossed a line it can never uncross. This isn't about basketball anymore. This is about identity, ideology, and whether a player has the right to say that biological women deserve their own spaces.
On Tuesday, July 28th, before the Indiana Fever take on the Seattle Storm, the rally will show public support for Indiana Fever guard Sophie Cunningham, who has faced a wave of criticism since a July 22nd ESPN profile in which she expressed support for female-only sports and locker rooms. Again, it is amazing that is controversial. That's where we're at.
So here's what actually happened. On July 22nd, ESPN published a profile of Indiana Fever guard Sophie Cunningham. In that interview, she made what should have been an unremarkable statement. She supports female-only sports and locker rooms. That's it. No attacks, no inflammatory language, just a straightforward position that biological women should compete against biological women. Within hours, the backlash was immediate and vicious. WNBA media personalities started calling her transphobic. Fans flooded social media demanding the league issue a statement. And then came the announcement that changed everything. Multiple political groups organized a support rally outside Climate Pledge Arena in Seattle before the Fever played the Storm on July 28th. The rally's message was simple: women are real, and suddenly we had a full-blown crisis on our hands.
Women now is hate speech. You freaking lunatics. Or a more violent situation to escalate in today's climate. Let's go, Roberta. How about that? Founder at Beta Basket. You can't make this up. We all know Supreme Slow. There will be an anti-trans rally in Seattle tomorrow, ahead of the Storm game against the Fever.
Now look at how this is being framed. Media members aren't calling this a pro-women rally. They're calling it an anti-trans protest. They're not describing it as fans supporting a player who stood up for female athletes. They're describing it as a dangerous gathering that could incite violence. Let that sink in for a second. A rally celebrating women in women's sports is being treated like a security threat. Brian Kalbrowski, founder of Beta Basket, tweeted that he was considering skipping the game entirely to avoid any hate speech or violent situations. Hate speech. For saying women are real, Sydney Brunson, who spent 4 years at ESPN, asked if Commissioner Kathy Engelbert would address these anti-trans protesters showing up to support Cunningham. Notice the language there, not pro-women supporters, anti-trans protesters.
These people are space cadets. Truly. Wow. Chris Williamson. This guy is the biggest simp on the planet for these WNBA wokes. This is what Sophie Cunningham will be partly remembered for. I hope so. Bravo, cuck. I'm so disgusted in seeing this.
And here's where it gets even more absurd. Chris Williamson, one of the most vocal critics of the rally, said this is what Sophie Cunningham will be partly remembered for, as if supporting biological women in sports is some kind of stain on her legacy. He called the people organizing this rally low testosterone cucks and accused them of being weak men creating hard times. The irony is almost too perfect to be real, but the most unhinged response came from Sydney Brunson, who somehow managed to connect a women's sports rally to January 6th. Yes, you heard that right. She suggested that American citizens exercising their First Amendment rights at a basketball game was comparable to the Capitol riot. That's the level of hysteria we're dealing with here.
Roberta, who's too big of a puss to actually turn your replies on. I'm sure I'm blocked anyway. I mean, for crying out loud. Sydney Brunson in Phoenix. In Arizona. 4 years with ESPN, but not now, are you? Good morning. Any word from Kathy about tonight's Seattle Storm game where reportedly anti-trans protesters plan to show their support for Indiana Fever Sophie Cunningham?
Now let's talk about why this matters beyond just one rally in Seattle. The WNBA has the highest percentage of LGBTQ fans of any professional sports league in North America. That's a fact. The league has cultivated that fan base intentionally, and there's nothing wrong with that. But here's the problem. When you build your identity around being the most inclusive league, what happens when inclusion for one group means exclusion for another? Sophie Cunningham said biological women deserve their own sports and locker rooms. That position is supported by the vast majority of Americans across the political spectrum. Multiple polls show that somewhere between 70 and 80% of Americans believe biological males should not compete in women's sports. This isn't a fringe position. This is mainstream common sense. But in the WNBA's core fan base, that position is being treated as bigotry. And that creates an impossible situation for players like Cunningham who dare to speak up.
As long as those right don't resemble January 6th. Did you brought up January 6th. Whoa. Psychotic. Okay. How do you go from a pro-women's rally to bringing up January 6th? Oh, because I'm triggered by anything that might be right-leaning. I'm so confused about how this is a bad thing. Now women want to compete against boys and men.
Look at the responses from regular fans pushing back against the media hysteria. One person wrote, "I'm so confused about how there's a bad thing now. Women want to compete against boys and men?" Another said, "It's interesting how you frame it as anti-trans instead of what it is, which is pro-women, pro-girl, pro-fairness. These aren't professional pundits or political activists. These are just people watching this unfold and recognizing the absurdity. And they're asking the obvious question that no one in WNBA media seems willing to address. When did supporting women become controversial in a women's league? Because that's what we're really talking about here. Not trans rights, not bathroom bills. Not any of the broader political debates happening in this country. We're talking about whether a woman playing in a women's professional basketball league is allowed to say that women's sports should be for women."
Pro-fairness. Damn. What's wrong with the freedom of speech and protesting? Yeah, I mean, odds are they're not going to burn down a CVS while they're out there having this rally. Just call me crazy. Now, whether or not being in Seattle, they don't end up getting arrested for nothing, good luck. Seattle is radically insane.
Here's what makes this particularly dangerous for the league. The WNBA is already struggling with mainstream acceptance. Viewership is up significantly this season, largely thanks to rookies like Caitlin Clark and Angel Reese bringing new attention to the league. But that new audience is not the same as the league's traditional core fan base. The new viewers are more casual, more mainstream, and yes, more likely to agree with Sophie Cunningham's position on biological women in sports. So when WNBA media personalities attack Cunningham and call her supporters dangerous, they're not just attacking one player, they're attacking the values of the very audience the league needs to grow. They're telling millions of potential new fans that if you believe women's sports should be for biological women, you're not welcome here. You're a bigot. You're transphobic. You're part of the problem. That's not a sustainable strategy for a league that desperately needs broader appeal to survive financially.
There's no such thing as an anti-trans march or movement. Low testosterone cucks like Chris Williamson are a perfect example of weak men creating hard times. I don't know. It sounds like he's pro-man to me. Just come swinging into the girls' locker room. No problems. I'm sure he'd like to sit in the corner and watch that. Chris?
And let's be brutally honest about what's happening in Seattle. This rally is being organized by local female athletes and political groups who support women's sports. They're not going there to protest against anyone. They're going there to support Sophie Cunningham for having the courage to say something that most people believe but are too afraid to say publicly. And the fact that this is being treated as dangerous or hateful tells you everything you need to know about how far the conversation has shifted from reality. One commenter pointed out that odds are they're not going to burn down a CVS while they're out there having this rally. That's a reference to the 2020 protests where actual violence and property destruction were often excused or justified by many of the same people, now clutching their pearls about a peaceful gathering of women supporting women's sports. The double standard is staggering.
Oh, call the FBI! You mean my boy Cash? We inviting him? Tell me what you think. Hit the subscribe button. Peace. I'm out.
So what happens next? Because this isn't going away. Sophie Cunningham didn't back down from her comments. The rally went forward despite the backlash. And now you have two completely incompatible visions for what the WNBA should be fighting for space in the same league. On one side, you have the traditional LGBTQ fan base that sees any defense of biological sex categories as an attack on trans inclusion. On the other side, you have a growing mainstream audience that sees defending women's sports as common sense and wonders why it's even controversial. Both groups are watching the same league. Both groups are buying tickets and merchandise, but they fundamentally disagree about what the league should stand for. The WNBA can't make both groups happy, and Commissioner Cathy Engelbert's silence on this issue is deafening. She hasn't defended Cunningham, she hasn't condemned the rally, she hasn't said a single word about whether players are allowed to express support for biological women's sports without being labeled bigots by league media. That silence is a choice, and it's a choice that's going to have consequences. Here's what makes Sophie Cunningham's situation so important to understand. She didn't go looking for this fight. She didn't publish an op-ed or hold a press conference or start a political movement. She answered a question honestly in an ESPN profile. She said she believes in female-only sports and locker rooms for biological women. That's it. No manifesto, no call to action, just a straightforward statement of her beliefs. And for that, she's being treated like she committed some kind of moral crime. WNBA media members are saying she's inciting hatred. Fans are demanding she be disciplined by the league. Other players are subtweeting her without naming her directly, all because she said women's sports should be for women. Think about the precedent that sets. If Sophie Cunningham can be vilified for expressing that position, what player is ever going to speak honestly about anything controversial again? The message being sent is crystal clear. Stay in line, repeat the approved talking points, or prepare to be destroyed. That's not healthy for any league, but it's especially dangerous for a league that's trying to build authentic connections with a broader audience. People can smell inauthenticity from a mile away. And when every player is terrified to say what they actually think about anything that matters, you end up with boring corporate robots giving boring corporate answers. That doesn't build fan bases. That doesn't create compelling storylines. That doesn't make people care. Now let's talk about the rally organizers for a second, because they're being completely mischaracterized. These aren't alt-right activists or hate groups or any of the other labels being thrown around. The rally was organized by local female athletes and women's advocacy groups in the Seattle area. Their stated purpose was to show public support for Sophie Cunningham and celebrate women's sports. That's not a dog whistle. That's not coded language. That's literally what they said they were doing. But because they use the phrase women are real, and because they support biological sex categories in sports, they're being treated like extremists. Media members are calling them dangerous. Fans are saying their presence at the game creates an unsafe environment. And all of this is happening because they believe the same thing that the vast majority of Americans believe, that biological males should not compete against biological females in sports. The disconnect between mainstream public opinion and WNBA media opinion on this issue is massive, and that disconnect is going to become a major problem for the league as it tries to grow beyond its traditional fan base. Because you can't tell 70 to 80% of the country that their views are hateful and bigoted, and then expect them to become passionate supporters of your league. Here's another angle that's not getting enough attention. What about the other players in the WNBA who agree with Sophie Cunningham but are too afraid to say so publicly? Because I guarantee you she's not the only one. There are absolutely other players who believe in biological sex categories in sports but have watched the backlash against Cunningham and decided it's not worth the risk to speak up. And that's a problem, not just for those individual players, but for the league as a whole. Because when you create an environment where people are afraid to express mainstream opinions, you're not creating inclusion, you're creating conformity through intimidation. You're telling people that there's one acceptable position on this issue, and any deviation from that position will result in professional and social consequences. That's not progressive, that's not enlightened, that's authoritarian. And it's exactly the kind of thing that drives people away from institutions they used to support. Let's also address the security concerns being raised about this rally. Multiple media members suggested that the gathering could lead to violence or hate speech. They compared it to dangerous protests. They said they were considering skipping the game because they felt unsafe. And all of this was based on nothing more than the fact that women were gathering to support women's sports. There was no history of violence from these groups, no threats made. No weapons, no calls for confrontation, just a peaceful rally supporting a player who said something they agreed with. But because the rally's message contradicted the preferred narrative of WNBA media, it had to be characterized as dangerous. It had to be framed as a threat. Because if you admit that it's just normal people expressing normal opinions, then you have to confront the fact that maybe those opinions aren't actually extreme or hateful. And here's the thing about Seattle specifically. This is one of the most progressive cities in America. The Storm's fanbase skews heavily toward the LGBTQ community. Climate Pledge Arena is not exactly a hotbed of right-wing activism, so the fact that this rally was organized in Seattle of all places tells you something important. This issue transcends traditional political divides. There are progressive women who support LGBTQ rights in every other context, but draw the line at biological males competing in women's sports. There are liberal feminists who believe that sex-based categories exist for a reason and need to be protected. These aren't conservatives trying to score political points. These are women across the political spectrum who believe that women's sports matter and that biological sex matters in the context of athletic competition. The WNBA's refusal to acknowledge that these women exist, that their concerns are legitimate, that their position is held by the vast majority of Americans, is going to come back to haunt the league. Because you can't build a sustainable business model by alienating most of your potential audience in service of appeasing your loudest activists. Now let's talk about what this means for the future of the WNBA, because this controversy isn't happening in a vacuum. The league is at a critical juncture right now. Viewership is up, attendance is improving, sponsorship deals are increasing. There's genuine momentum for the first time in years. But that momentum is fragile. And if the league gets this issue wrong, if they side with the activists over the mainstream audience, they could kill their own growth before it really gets started. Imagine you're a casual sports fan who just started watching the WNBA this season because of Caitlin Clark. You're enjoying the games, you're impressed by the talent, you're thinking about buying a jersey or going to a game, and then you see this controversy unfold. You see a player being attacked for saying women's sports should be for women. You see media members calling peaceful supporters dangerous and hateful. You see the league staying silent while one of their players gets destroyed for expressing a mainstream opinion. What do? Do you stick around and support a league that apparently thinks your values are bigoted? Or do you just go back to watching the NBA or NFL or literally any other sport where you don't have to navigate this kind of ideological minefield just to enjoy a game? For a lot of people, the answer is going to be the latter. And that's a tragedy for the WNBA, because they desperately need those casual fans to become committed fans if the league is ever going to achieve financial sustainability. The Sophie Cunningham situation is a test case for how the WNBA handles dissent from approved narratives. And so far, the league is failing that test miserably by staying silent, by allowing media members to attack Cunningham without pushback, by treating peaceful supporters like security threats. The league is sending a clear message: conform or be cast out. That's not a recipe for growth. That's a recipe for remaining a niche league with a small, ideologically homogeneous fan base that can't support the league financially without massive subsidies from the NBA. The question now is whether anyone in WNBA leadership has the courage to stand up and say what needs to be said, that Sophie Cunningham has the right to her opinions, that supporting biological women's sports is not hateful or bigoted, and that the league welcomes fans from across the political spectrum who share a love of women's basketball. That statement shouldn't be controversial, it should be obvious. But in the current climate, it would be revolutionary. And until someone in leadership makes that statement, until the league stops treating mainstream opinions as dangerous extremism, the WNBA is going to continue struggling with the same fundamental problem. They're trying to grow a league, while simultaneously telling most of America that they're not welcome. So here's the real question: was Sophie Cunningham wrong to say what she said? Should she have just kept her mouth shut and avoided this whole controversy? Or did she do exactly what athletes should do, which is speak honestly about issues that matter to them, even when it's uncomfortable? Because if we've reached a point where female athletes can't advocate for female sports without being called bigots, then we've lost something important. We've sacrificed truth on the altar of ideology, and that's not progress. That's regression, dressed up in progressive language. The rally in Seattle happened